The United States and NATO are once again testing Russia's red lines. And as we have seen throughout the conflict in Ukraine, the United States and NATO have tested these red lines to the point where Russia has been pushed into very dramatic responses, ones that could bring World War III about. For example, tactical nuclear drills being conducted just this past May. But this red line is even more significant, in my opinion, even in the past when we had David Cameron, for example, and Emmanuel Macron talk about using Western weapons given to Ukraine on Russia and in Russian territory. Now, this policy is becoming universal among NATO members. And of course, when we're talking about NATO, we're talking about the United States. So the United States is now giving the green light after several weeks of hand wringing, of saying that it was not going to do this. Now, according to the Politico, we are now seeing the Biden administration green light permission to Ukraine to use U.S. weapons to strike Russia. And what Russia has said is this makes the United States a party to the conflict in a way that means U.S. assets, U.S. targets are now possibly under the under the auspices of what Russia can strike back at. But we're going to get into that soon. But here's a story. A major reversal that will help Ukraine better defend its second largest city. Biden secretly is giving Ukraine permission to strike inside of Russia with U.S. weapons. The Biden administration has quietly given Ukraine permission to strike inside of Russia solely near the area of Kharkov, using U.S.-provided weapons, 3 officials of the United States and 2 other people familiar with the move said on May 30th, a major reversal that will help Ukraine better defend its second largest city. The president recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine is able to use U.S. weapons to counter-fire purposes in Kharkov so Ukraine can hit back at Russian forces, hitting them or preparing to hit them, the U.S. official said, adding the policy of not allowing long-range strikes inside Russia has not changed. Ukraine has been asking the U.S. to make this official policy change only after Russia's offensive in Kharkov began this month. The official added, all the people were granted anonymity to discuss internal decisions that have not yet been announced. So this is essentially a leak, according to the sources. So this has been happening over the past several weeks, more so-called flexibility. But there is a contradiction in these reports. And here is what the New York Times had to say, because I want to show you who have already, and this is a universal policy within NATO dictated by the United States. This was the New York Times report taking the fight to Russia. This has been the mantra of late. The West weighs Ukraine's use of its weapons. More NATO allies are backing Kiev's plea to allow forces to conduct strikes in Russian territory with Western weapons. But let me go to the section where it talks about those backing strikes on Russian soil. It says every country giving weapons to Ukraine has the right to prescribe how they were used, according to New York Times. And so far, Britain, Canada, Czech Republic, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Poland have stated their support for Ukraine hitting military targets on Russian territory. Then you have countries that are more cautious. Germany and Sweden, for example, conditioned approval solely within the framework of international law, which is hilarious because none of this can actually be justified with international law. He was spelling out a requirement that other countries have also maintained over the past 2 years arming Ukraine, even if it was not voiced prominently. So Britain was one of the first to argue loosening the restraints, as I mentioned, with Foreign Minister David Cameron's visit to Kiev, saying it has the right to use whatever it wants. Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can't quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself, or you can understand. But here's what the United States, Belgium, and Italy, several countries, said they're not ready to let Ukraine use weapons inside of Russia to target Russian assets, citing that risks which can be hard to anticipate. So there you have the New York Times basically saying something completely different. I think this just shows how completely and utterly useless the United States is, these so-called anonymous officials. It is quite clear that this is the official policy nonetheless. But I wanted to show you how Vladimir Putin and Russia particularly might respond. This has been making the rounds And a lot of people have been saying that this is Vladimir Putin calling for total war. Now, Vladimir Putin often gives speeches, and here's just a snippet of one recently where he talks about how Russians all over the country, all Russians, and everyone who is involved in Russian society should be viewing the current historical situation. And this speech was directly given after many European countries have voiced their support for Ukraine, using their weapons to target Russian territory.
Но прошу вас обратить внимание вот на что. Мы все понимаем, во всяком случае, все должны понимать, в какое время мы живем и через какой исторический этап проходит Россия. А если мы это понимаем, то все должны работать как на линии фронта. Все должны чувствовать себя мобилизованными. И только так мы добьемся тех целей, которые перед собой ставим.
So that should be chilling for the United States, for NATO, for the neocons that are directing this policy, because that is exactly the approach that friend of the show, Scott Ritter, has talked about here, where the entirety of Russian society is mobilized, as Vladimir Putin said, and is mobilizing like they are on the front, meaning that they are not only prepared to give their lives for the special military operation, but they're willing to give their lives for Russia, making these threats absolutely and utterly just not just irresponsible, but incredibly dangerous, given the fact that any kind of conflict between Russia, the United States, and NATO, the US and NATO as one, in direct conflict with Russia, will lead to a cataclysmic war that would inevitably go nuclear. And Russia is not so much hesitating to state this fact, whatever one may think of it. Here is what an article, an intelligence drop. It's time for Russia to drop a nuclear bomb. This was written by a member of the Russian Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, Deputy Director of World Economy and International Politics at Moscow's Higher School of Economics. And he said the U.S. bloc has lost its fear of the mushroom cloud, but seeing one perhaps may focus some minds. So again, this was written on the Intel drop directly after it was announced that several European countries, NATO countries, and now the United States have decided to, and this is a direct response to an argument being made inside of Russian policy and think tank circles that maybe, just maybe, there needs to be a nuclear bomb dropped. And I want to just scroll down to the reasons for why, for what Russia should do actually. So in response to this threat, because this is what this author is addressing, he said, we should first tell the US and NATO roughly what Moscow already told London after Cameron's words about Ukraine's right to strike anywhere with British Storm Shadow missiles. Namely, that in the event of an attack on quote-unquote old Russian territory, Moscow reserves the right to strike any facilities of the countries concerned, including the US and anywhere in the world. There are many American military bases dotted around the globe. Yes, the United States has 800 plus military bases, and there is no shortage of those in the so-called Central and Eastern European axis. Secondly, it is important to officially declare if the U.S. and NATO launches a non-nuclear strike on Russian territory in response to such a Russian strike, Moscow may in turn use nuclear weapons in full accordance with the fundamentals of Russian state policy in the field of nuclear deterrence. Thirdly, since there has been talk of possible attacks not only on British but also on American facilities and of a possible direct military response from the U.S., it would be desirable to hold exercises on the use of strategic nuclear forces in addition to the current exercise on the use of tactical weapons. So what he is actually describing is the escalation ladder, that this move by the United States and by NATO to approve weapons given to Ukraine to be used on Russian soil then makes the United States and NATO direct parties to the war, and their assets will be targeted. And if they are targeted, you can expect the United States and NATO to respond and target Russian assets directly. And then that's where you have the escalation ladder, which he is describing. And he mentioned the drills that I talked about that were conducted in May and that will continue to be ongoing for Russia that those drills should be escalated if this were to happen to more strategic nuclear forces, not just tactical weapons, meaning that these drills will not just get bigger, but the weapons that will be deployed, the nuclear weapons that will be deployed, will be more damaging. And then finally, to confirm the seriousness of Russia's intentions and to convince our adversaries of Moscow's willingness to escalate, it's worth considering a demonstration, i.e. non-aggressive nuclear explosion. The political and psychological effect of an atomic mushroom cloud broadcast live on all the world's television channels will hopefully bring Western politicians back to one thing that prevented wars between great powers after 1945, in which they have now largely lost: the fear of nuclear war. So that's a very serious. Now, one might say, okay, well, how much influence does this particular person have? Where are they actually in Russian, in terms of influence over Russia government policy, Russian military policy? Well, that is unclear, but the fact that it is being published, that it means that it is being talked about. And that's being talked about likely at the highest levels of official Russia, but also at the levels of those who are involved in the special military operation, those who are looking at this from the Russian side and saying, well, how does one stop these escalations? How does one prevent the United States and NATO from doing the unthinkable? What does Russia have to do to reestablish deterrence? Because obviously what's happening is not working. The United States and NATO are still willing to go another extra mile to bring the world closer to nuclear Armageddon. And so these warnings should be taken very, very seriously from Vladimir Putin when he says everyone should operate like they are on the front, meaning that everything that they do, everything that people do, that this is a real wartime situation for Russia. It is not in the United States and NATO countries, the US and NATO countries. There is no perspective on this. This is simply a proxy war that is over there, where US weapons are over there, and all of the negative impact, all of the negative perceptions of this conflict are all based on how it is not reflecting and not benefiting US national interests, meaning that people in the United States are not benefiting from the war. And that is all important. But nonetheless, it does not mean that anyone in the United States, for the most part, views this war as existential, other than the most fanatical Banderite supporting forces that exist in the collective West. That's a tiny minority of the overall general population, just like the electorate in the United States actually is a minority of the US population. But nonetheless, those who vote. But nonetheless, it is important now. I wanted to bring it to friend of the show, Scott Ritter, who gave a great report for Sputnik on this issue. So I wanted to hear how he weighs in on this, because I think usually his analysis is generally important to this, because he has expertise in military affairs. So here we go. Here's friend of the show, Scott Ritter, for Sputnik. He gave this analysis in response to the news that there will be weapons from the United States and from NATO striking Russian territory.
President Putin made it clear that he understands how these systems work. Therefore, that means that the Russians understand what needs to be targeted. Locations not only inside Ukraine, but on the soil of NATO members. Now, the NATO members and NATO itself will claim that this support of Ukraine is being done by sovereign states, not by NATO as an entity. So when Russia retaliates against the sovereign states, NATO better not rally around these nations and suddenly proclaim Article 5 collective self-defense protections. Because if they do that, then it's clear that this is a NATO confrontation against Russia. And if NATO chooses then to respond by launching additional attacks against Russia, remember, these aren't retaliation attacks. Russia is retaliating against NATO attacks against its territory. This would be an all-out assault by NATO against Russia. And former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev made it clear that the Russian response would be nuclear. And this would lead to a general nuclear exchange in the end of the world. That's where we're at right now. This isn't about helping Ukraine. This isn't about Ukraine defending itself. This is about a larger plan by the collective West, by NATO, by the United States to strategically defeat Russia. Now, in some ways, Russia is to blame here. Let me say why. Because Russia continuously says that it is seeking a peaceful solution. Russia continuously indicates it is looking for a negotiated settlement. These Russian postures, which are very reasonable, are being misinterpreted in the West as a sign of Russian weakness. And therefore, the collective determination of the West is that they just continue to pressure Russia, ratchet up the pressure, that Russia will fold like a house of cards and run to the peace table and bring an end to this conflict. That's not going to happen. This is a misreading of the situation by the West. And so the West now will attack Russia, trying to pressure Russia to the peace table. But all it will do is guarantee a Russian response that if the West doesn't respond properly to that, if the West thinks that it therefore has a right to strike Russia in return, will lead to Armageddon, the end of the world. That's where we're at today. This isn't a game. This isn't a joke. This is the end of all humanity.
Yeah, I mean that's where things are headed with this conflict, and it's a very important point that Scott made there about peace, about how Russia has essentially inconsistently communicated that it is willing to engage in peaceful negotiations should Russia's position be respected, should Russia have a rightful seat at the table. I mean, when we talk about Zelensky's so-called peace initiative that China and Joe Biden himself have not even committed to, China won't commit to it, and you'll never see that. But even Joe Biden has refused. I think he decided to choose a rich donor fest, the money he wants to raise for his what will likely be a failed presidential campaign. He decided to attend this instead. Nonetheless, Russia has been the single force in this conflict. If we think about the players in this conflict being Russia, Ukraine, NATO, of course, with the United States at the head, it has been Russia as a single force consistently talking about negotiations being a top priority. And Scott is right. This means that those who have no interest in negotiations, those very forces inside of the United States and NATO that sabotaged the Minsk Accords, that made it so the peace plan that was signed by Ukraine in late March and April of 2022 was also jettisoned, that these same forces that spurred these horrific developments, that created the conditions for this ongoing, protracted war of attrition that exists now, that has taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and has created a complete rump state, essentially, in Ukraine, an illegitimate proxy where Zelensky is not even viewed as the legitimate leader anymore as of May 20th, 2024, where you have just this dire situation in Ukraine, all created by the circumstances laid out by the United States and NATO. It is indeed true that these very same forces, the neocons, view Russia as weak for its position on negotiations, that there are significant forces inside of the collective West that want to see a larger campaign of war. That is why this has always been so serious. It is not just that the United States has some kind of military objective for Ukraine. No, it is about getting Russia to fold, as Scott said, like a house of cards, to be dismembered, to be destabilized, to crumble, to fall, to have Vladimir Putin and his leadership be overtaken and supplanted by a more Yeltsin-like kind of regime. It's absolute fantasy given the balance of forces politically in the United States. But when has that ever stopped the United States before? We can look at what's happening in Gaza right now, where you have the axis of resistance, as Professor Morandi said on this show. Saeed Mohammed Morandi said Israel is the one that is surrounded by resistance forces and has no hope for victory, yet the United States supports Israel unconditionally nonetheless. There are no red lines there for Israel that the United States won't absolutely cave to. The same goes for the Asia Pacific. Where in the hell can we see an actual victory for the United States against China in the Asia Pacific militarily, let alone in any other area? And they're all connected, as we know. China's rapid economic development is not ceasing. We can see absolutely just incredible developments, from curing diabetes with cell therapy. Now there is a test and a trial happening where an individual has actually not been insulin dependent for many months after 3 months of cell therapy. And then we also have a BYD vehicle that can go 2,000 kilometers about to be rolled out, a hybrid vehicle about to be rolled out, the distance between New York to Miami. These are developments that show the United States militarily has no chance if China. I've been to China 3 times. Never did I get the sense that anyone is afraid of war or believes they're at war. The United States, though, is preparing for such a thing, and that's what is happening in Ukraine. No one in everyone in Russia understands the call here. That is what Scott Ritter has said on this program over and over again. And I think it's quite clear from these escalations that the United States and NATO absolutely have no off ramp. They have no restraint. And Russia is going to have to be the one, just like China, just like Iran, just like all countries in the multipolar world, especially the leaders of it, are going to face one way or another. They're going to face the reality that they are going to have to either establish a deterrence. They're going to have to show the United States and NATO the recklessness of its moves. They're going to have to do what the United States always says about Russia, about China, about Iran. This is what they always say, that the United States has to be the one to show that China, for example, would be absolutely devastated if it were to invade Taiwan. Well, actually, the truth is that Russia, China, Iran, these countries, they're going to have to be the ones. They already have shown that they need to be the ones to establish deterrence. And so in the case of Russia here, we are seeing that Russia is already contemplating how to do this, and that it could involve an escalation, a move up the escalation ladder toward nuclear war, a nuclear demonstration. Now, if a nuclear demonstration were to occur, this would absolutely just the minds, the heads would come skyrocketing off. They would be just absolutely blown away by this show of force, and of course, if not done correctly, could lead toward a path of no return. But we can be confident that Russia is not going to, of course, participate in any kind of nuclear actions in this way that would do this. If Iran's Operation True Promise, for example, is any indication, the multipolar world understands that it has to be the one that is restrained. It has to be the one that thinks strategically and that thinks about the betterment of humanity when it is seeking out deterrent policies. So we can expect Russia to move through this strategically in a step-by-step fashion. We're already seeing that with the tactical nuclear drills. We're seeing that with major warnings. Should U.S. weapons, should NATO weapons officially begin hitting Russian territory, should that be then, they already have been, let's be honest, Belgorod. We know that these weapons are supplied by the United States and NATO. But once they have the official stamp on it, and once they begin to take the form of an actual military campaign in response and in retaliation to Russia's successful offensive in Kharkov. Remember, this is all about a successful move in Kharkov to secure that area so that these attacks cannot happen. This is what Vladimir Putin has said from the very beginning about why there is a campaign, right? Why there is an offensive in Kharkov in particular. But once that happens, we will see Russia's response, and Russia will go through this escalation ladder, and it will test NATO's capacity for restraint. There will be strikes on NATO armaments. This has been happening from the very beginning. There will be a retribution, but I believe Russia will keep this within the bounds of Ukraine. We are not going to see Russia strike NATO installations, NATO sites, the United States proper. That's not going to happen. And certainly that's not going to happen anytime soon. But nonetheless, what the United States, what NATO knows, and what we should all be aware of is that this means that Russia will accelerate its campaign and will continue to make significant progress on the battlefield against Ukraine when everything is going against Ukraine, from the political situation becoming increasingly unstable. Zelensky is bullying the United States, is lashing out, firing people close to the United States. It's an absolute nightmare right now for the US and NATO project in Ukraine. So we can expect Russia to continue to make its very methodical moves to neutralize the situation. But we all know that the real head of the monster here is the United States and NATO. And that is where the unpredictability lies, because the more that Russian victory becomes inevitable, the more desperate the United States becomes to prevent it. So we will all have to be on very close watch on what happens, because Vladimir Putin, Russia in general, they're not bluffing. This is not a bluff. This is not, oh, we are not going to respond in any kind of way. No, there will be retaliation. It's just that Russia is far smarter in how it goes about this than the United States and NATO, and understands who it is facing and what it is facing. How long ago was it that Dmitry Peskov said that Russia is at war, knows it is at war with NATO? Given this, it is going to take all the measures into account to ensure that such a conflict and such a war does not bleed in, spill over into our worst nightmare, which is nuclear war. But that doesn't mean that Russia isn't talking about it, isn't preparing for it, and cannot engage in it once the United States and NATO shows that it is all that is left at the disposal to stop it from essentially destroying Russia and destroying the multipolar, or attempting to destroy the multipolar world order. That is what Russia, and I believe Russian people, will sacrifice a lot to protect. And that is what is at stake here. So we all have to be on very close watch on what the United States and what NATO is doing, and be ready to address the real problem here, which resides in Washington, the Pentagon, the CIA, and of course, NATO proper. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.